Now, the next class of engines are not exactly on everyone's popularity list, but I simply couldn't leave them out. Based on Leyland buses, whether you love them or you hate them, the Pacers have certainly left their marks on British railway history. The road to modernisation of the railway had actually started 18 years before wind of steam. Moves were made to look at other forms of power. Early diesel locomotives were unreliable, especially compared to its steam counterparts, and while the move to electric engines was deemed as a potential plan, British Rail simply didn't have the capital to try and electrify the whole network at the time. With the expansion of the roads, every new motorway and trunk road took more and more freight and passengers off their lines. It wasn't long before the cost of coal, water, maintenance and the extra staff pushed British Rail into the red for the first time. For the railway to be saved, it was obvious that drastic action would be needed. Thankfully for the railway, many people saw the value in it and saw it as an essential part of our country's infrastructure. A research centre in Derby was created and opened in 1964 that was dedicated into improving the railway. From improving batteries to switches and signals, the research centre was tasked with investigating every aspect of railway life, find its shortfalls and inefficiencies, and make recommendations and improvements to streamline these services. One of the biggest challenges was to streamline and improve freight services in an effort to compete with the lorries that were taking their business. They found that the wagons that British Rail had used for years were inefficient and considerably slower than their road counterparts. There was also thousands and thousands of them, taking up valuable marshalling space around the country. When the researchers looked closer, they found for what one man and lorry could move on the roads, it took several in the yards. A shunter or pilot engine and a crew to marshal and create the train, an engine, crew and a guard to control the brake van and to take the freight, and a secondary shunter to collect all or part of the train at the end of the journey. Even after all that, the company still may need to rely on the road and a railway lorry to take the freight from the railways to the destination. The first problem that they tackled was the cars themselves. The basis of the cars hadn't changed much since the early part of the 20th century and were prone to derailment at high speeds. The research team decided that this would be their starting point. If they could shorten the journey time without incident by increasing the speed that the train could move, this would give British Rail a fighting chance. Following several tests and careful calculations, it was determined that if they took into account the vertical movement as well as the horizontal movement of the train at speed, then the chance of derailment began to fall. From the research, the team built the first high-speed freight power car that was capable of doing 100 miles an hour, and the cars themselves were redesigned with new wheels and new suspensions. 6 variants of this train were built and were a great success. By the time they had hit the main line, the beaching axe was in full swing, and steam had made way for diesel, which had become much more economical. The passengers still relied on rolling stock and coaches to get around, but diesels required little to no turnaround time and a much smaller crew. Thanks to its new bogie wheels and improved suspension, the freights were doing well on the line, but there was still need to improve the rolling stock. British Rail was also under pressure. The diesels running the line were becoming dated, and it was soon becoming costly to run them, especially on rural lines that were saved from the beaching axe by concerned locals or by government grants. British Rail knew that these grants would not last forever, and if they couldn't afford to run the trains, the line would face closure. The answer to the problem came from an unlikely source. The Leyland Bus Company was a well-known company that had grown alongside the railway and that was accredited with making sturdy, steel-framed buses. The buses were economical to build and were practical. It also helped that Leyland had recently become nationalised, and it was decided that if an undercarriage of a high-speed vehicle was married with the Leyland bus's steel upper frame, then they would create a cheap, easy-to-run, self-propelled railcar. and because both rail and bus were nationalised, it was considered uniform across the public transport industry. It was also a godsend for Leyland, as they too were slipping into the red. Testing of the first Leyland rail bus began in 1978 and went rather well, and soon plans were in place to develop a new train for use along the network. But the Conservative government were heavily critical of British Rail and didn't want to fund the project and were in favour of closing lines and replacing trains with buses. The amalgamation of the two failing businesses consolidated and then created what we know as the Pacer. The Pacer was never meant to be the ultimate solution. However, it did fill the need when coaches and other rolling stock were rapidly becoming obsolete. As other lines were faced with closure, the Pacers got going, keeping those lines up and running. They were simple, just simply seats on wheels with no frills travel that was affordable. By the late 80s, the Leyland Group had been privatised and cracks began to show, quite literally, in the Leyland fleet. Although they did save many lines, they were very unreliable, and in 1988 the Leyland buses' engines gave way for more reliable Volvo engines, and with the privatisation of the railway lines in 1994, there was no uniform rollout of the removal of the stopgap Pacers. The passengers were not very impressed with the engines themselves. They were uncomfortable, they had a terrible ride compared to the traditional coaches, and the passengers would eventually name the Pacer as the nodding donkey as it bucked along, especially on the older and more uneven track. While the South rarely, if ever, embraced the Pacer, the North endured them, especially in the Yorkshire and rural areas. The trains kept the people connected, but grumblings of the Pacer's lack of comfort, their lack of accessibility, soon began to reach the ears of the government. As the world became more connected and with the use of the internet, it became a luxury to be able to charge your phone from your train or even have a table. As a northerner myself, it seemed strange to say that it was a treat to have a Pacer with table seating. And even today, if you travel in the north, particularly on my line, you will still see that those seats always fill up first. The new Accessibility Act was really the turning point for the Pacer. The Act ensures that full accessibility must be provided for anybody using the train, and the Pacer simply couldn't meet the standard. Northern Rail ran its last Pacer 142001 in 2019 on the York to Leeds line via Harrogate. This train was one of the few lucky survivors and has joined the likes of the Duchess of Hamilton and the Mallard in the National Collection. But what of the others? Many of the Pacers have already been scrapped and recycled, and some have been sent to countries such as Iran. There are still some operating today, but these are dwindling as the new stock is introduced on the network. Today, the government is looking at new initiatives to turn many Pacers into cafes or classrooms. I think this is novel and an interesting way to recycle the trains, and it's not unheard of before, as many older carriages shared the same fate with great results. All in all, like them or loathe them, we do have a lot to thank the Pacer for, particularly up north. They don't have the streamlining like the Duchess of Hamilton or the looks of the A4 class, but I do feel it's right that at least one of these engines is preserved. The Pacer was my childhood and the first train I ever really rode on, and even today as I look out of the window in my table seat, I still can't help thinking of the nodding donkeys of my youth. And if it wasn't for the Pacer taking me to the museum, my line would have also closed and my love of trains would never have been cemented. So with that regard, I'd like to say thank you to the Leyland Pacer, the openly loathed but quietly loved passenger train.